Please give a warm, 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 warm welcome to our dear friend Louis Trippett.
I did not know I had a Pinterest account. And I was wondering when Peter told me he was going to introduce me what he would say, because there's not a whole lot to say. I mean, I have been around NCS long enough to know that I'm not the typical NCS speaker. I am not an investment banker. I don't have a hedge fund. I haven't turned around a Fortune 500 company. I don't have a groundbreaking ministry. And I've never even played in the NBA, as a guy 2 weeks ago. So, you know, I'm a lawyer, which means the only thing I know how to do is argue, and I don't have any expertise in anything else. So you are completely free to disagree with me on anything that I say here today. But I've also been around NCS long enough to know that what was shown in that video is true, and that is God is at work in everyone's life. And everyone has a story that I benefit from hearing. And I've also seen that it's a great benefit to be able to tell your story and have people listen and appreciate your story. So I appreciate your ministry to me by listening to me today and hearing my most recent story. So I've tried to get this. I've entitled this Journeys of Grief. This is a picture of my wife, Anne, taken a few years ago when we were at the Metropolitan Opera. We were having dinner at the restaurant there. We weren't really big opera people, but we figured out that you could sometimes get rush tickets for $20 to the opera and get orchestra seats for $20. And so when we got that, we would spend the money on going to dinner in the restaurant in the Metropolitan Opera and then just enjoy it. Sometimes when we couldn't get into the restaurant, she would drive in and she would bring a bottle of Prosecco or champagne and park in the parking lot at Lincoln Center. And during intermission, we would tailgate. We would go into the parking lot and have our champagne in our car and go back. She was obviously beautiful. She was fun. She was outgoing. She was passionate about Jesus. She was passionate about her kids and her family. And she even loved me. And as the author of A Man Called Otto said, I was black and white, and she was my color. We were married at Trinity Baptist Church on East 61st Street in Manhattan on December 30th, 1978. There we are, leaving the church in a horse-drawn carriage back in the days when that was legal. We had 4 kids, all grown, all married, and they have generated so far 13 grandchildren. And yes, I know all their names. I get that question all the time. I have 13 grandkids. Do you know their names? Yes, I know their names. And I know their birthdays, or approximately when their birthdays are. I know the month. There's 5 of them in April, so those sometimes hard to get. So on December 23rd, 2015, I went to my office in Manhattan just to wrap up a couple of things before I took off for the Christmas vacation. And when I got to the office, my paralegal told me that my wife's doctor had called and I needed to call her because she was in the hospital. So I called her, and she said that Anne had come in to see her, and she determined quickly that she was in what was called 100% heart block, and so she was taken by ambulance to the hospital. She told me that heart block was not a heart attack. It was something different. And they were going to be testing to see, what was the cause of the heart block. She stayed in the hospital overnight. She had a pacemaker put in, and the young doctor there said that he was going to find out why an otherwise healthy 58-year-old woman would end up in heart block. So they did a bunch of testing, and they found out that she had a condition called arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, ARVC, which is a very rare heart condition. It has nothing to do with arteries. Her arteries were perfectly clear. It has nothing to do with cholesterol. Her cholesterol was lower than mine, and I take cholesterol medication. So the normal things that do for heart treatment, bypass, stents, things like that, that did not apply. This condition is very rare, and the proteins that hold the heart muscles together began to deteriorate. And when that happens, the electrical signals of the heart start to fail. There's no treatment for it. There's nothing that you can do for it. It's usually, we were told, only diagnosed in an autopsy. When you hear of kids that are in sports and then suddenly die in the middle of a sports game, something like that, otherwise healthy, this is often sometimes the condition that they have. So we were told that you keep the heart as healthy as you can, keep as active as you can without overdoing it, and if you're lucky, the heart will last 5 years, and then you will need a heart transplant. So our life was relatively normal, for the years following that. She started, declining some activity. She was a tennis player. She stopped playing tennis. She kept playing golf. She kept, working around the house, gardening and everything. We could still travel. Gradually her activities declined, and when we could travel, she would have to have a wheelchair because she couldn't take the long walks at the hospital. We had a few run-ins with the hospital where she would go in for bleeding because she was on blood thinners, or she would go in for fluid drainage because she had fluid built up. But otherwise, the time after that was relatively normal. And then she went in for treatment to lower her immune system to receive a heart. She had a reaction to one of the main medications that they use for that. So they had to get her over that. They had to figure out what medications they could use. And then in October of 2020, she went into the hospital for that treatment to prepare for a heart transplant. And on December 23rd, 2020, exactly 5 years after she had gone into the hospital with heart block, she received a heart transplant. And we were excited. We thought this was it. This was the answer to prayer. Heart transplants actually have a very high success rate, over 80% survival rate of heart transplant, and we were excited. But there were complications from the beginning. She was put on extraordinary machines and stuff right away, and they weren't sure if it was rejection or something else. And then on January 5th, 2021, they went back in and opened her heart up to see if they could figure out what was wrong and do some other things and see why it wasn't working. And after that, she slowly began to recover. We actually were taken out of the ICU for a couple of days, and then she started getting infections. And she had one infection after the other, and after every infection that she fought off, including a flesh-eating bacteria that only 1/3 of the healthy people that have it ever survive, she fought that off, but she was weakened by each round of infection. And finally, in June, she had 2 infections at the same time, and in early July, the doctor who had been the most optimistic to me came in and said, I think we are fighting a losing battle. So in the next few days, I had to give the order to stop the feeding tube, to turn off the dialysis, to turn off the ventilator. And on July 8th, 2021, with my oldest daughter and my son in the room, we watched her take her last breath and pass into eternity. This is a photograph of a sculpture in Oslo, Norway. And to me, it is the best depiction of what I just described feels like. And that is, you are together, you are one, you are united, and death comes exactly between the two of you and rips you apart. That's what it felt like. Do you know how to deal with that? I didn't know how to deal with that. maybe I thought I did, but the grief that I experienced was like nothing that I expected. About a month after a funeral, a friend of mine, good friends that have a place in Florida on the beach, told me to come use their place and stay there as long as I needed. And so I decided I would go there. I would sit on the beach, me, Jesus, and my Bible, and I would figure this out. And I would come back, and I would be good to go. And I quickly realized that that's not what grief is like. It was going to be a long process, and I was going to need some help. So one thing I did, I identified 6 people that I knew, 6 guys that I knew that had lost their wives, and I decided I would go to each one of them and talk to them about it. One of them was a guy I grew up with. One of them, a guy who was in college. The rest of them were here. One of them is my friend Bob, who's here with me today, whose wife died 7 years ahead of Ann's death. And the one thing that all of these guys agreed on, in fact, the only thing that all guys agreed on was that it sucks. It really, really sucks. And so I started reading stuff, Christian stuff, non-Christian stuff, and things like that. And I didn't find that to be very helpful, honestly. It wasn't describing what I was feeling. It wasn't getting at what I needed to hear. I found a lot of it to be superficial, a lot of it to be flowery, and it just wasn't very helpful. I ran across things like this you've probably seen. You've heard of the 5 stages of grief. First there's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and time, and these come in waves, and maybe they overlap, but over time, you come to a place of acceptance. But in fact, that's actually what it looks like. Grief is a jumbled mess of all of those things and more. And here's another one I found. Here's a chart of, you start with shock and numbness and denial, and you work your way all the way down to loneliness, and then you gradually work your way back up with new relationships, new strength, and you end up with loss adjustment. Well, again, my experience is more like that. It's just a jumble of stuff. Grief cannot be diagrammed. It does not follow a pattern. It is as unique as a fingerprint to everybody because it goes deeply into your soul. I had great support. My kids could not have been more supportive. I have a great circle of supportive friends. My doctor is a friend and a client, and he's struck right with me, insisting to this day to meet with me every 2 weeks for breakfast to see how I'm doing. And so I had great support. But who was missing in action? Who didn't show up? It was my NCS brothers. Not you guys, because I'm not in this chapter, or maybe I will be now, but not been in this chapter. But the guys in my chapter, the guys in my energy group were missing in action. And the odd thing was, like, if I had marital problems, if I had financial problems, if I had drug problems, something like that, I think those guys would have been right there. But because of grief and because of loss, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do. We are grief illiterate. Not only as NCS, but as a society, we're grief illiterate. I get it. I'm the same way. For all the things we talk about, we don't really understand how to deal with grief. We're afraid of it, and so we avoid it. So I remember when I was growing up, my mother had a Sunday school teacher, and I was at a meeting at a house, and kids were playing, and we went from one room to the other, and I heard this teacher say, it's so ridiculous when you go to a funeral of a Christian, of somebody who's a Christian who died, and everybody's sad. You shouldn't be sad when somebody dies, if they're a Christian, because they're in heaven. They're better off than they were before. And then a few years later, this woman's house was on the paper route that I had. And I delivered papers to their house. And her husband To call him a grumpy old man would be an insult to grumpy old man. He was a real character. He made me, I had to deliver to his house first, even though I was out of the way, because if I didn't get to his house before the 5 o'clock news came on, then he wouldn't pay me for the paper. So he was quite a piece of work, okay? But I did it. And then he died. And for at least the next year, when I came to that house to collect my $1.30 for delivering the paper all month, she would always be in tears. She would always be in a nightgown and saying, "You don't have no idea what the pain is." So the idea that because we know that somebody's in heaven and because we will see them again is not a complete answer for the grief that we're feeling now. I am as certain as I am about anything that Anne is with Jesus now, and that's great. I'm also certain as I can be about anything that someday I will see her again when I go to see with Jesus. And that puts my grief and our griefs as Christian on a completely different level than those that don't have that hope. I don't know how anybody deals with it that does not have that hope. But it's not a complete answer to grief. It's not an answer to all the things that grief throws at us. Because it's not an answer when I wake up every morning as I did this morning and there's no one next to me in bed and the struggle that I have just to get up and get going. Or when I go to bed at night and I go to bed again alone at night. It's not enough to know that eventually I will see her again and that she's fine. I have no doubt she's fine. I'm the one who's a mess now. And actually, this is not Jesus' view of grief either. You know that at the grave of Lazarus, Jesus wept bitterly. He wept bitterly knowing that he was going to raise Lazarus, that in a few minutes everything was going to be fine. But he grieved and he wept bitterly at the thought of grief, the thought of death, because death is still an enemy that we are still under. And grief, Jesus compared grief to childbirth, to the pain of labor pains of going through childbirth. Now, despite what our politics are these days, none of us here are ever going to experience the pain of childbirth, right? We're not. No matter what operation you have, you're not going to experience that. But you, like me, might have observed it. I observed it 4 times with my wife. Every delivery is different. Every labor is different. Some are longer, some are shorter. Some require medicine, some require surgery. They're different between women. They're different by the same woman at different times. It's all different, but they all are extremely painful. You know, and can you imagine saying to your wife when she's in labor, "Oh, it's not that bad. You're having a baby. You should be happy. You should get over this." You know, or like, "Oh, this has been going on too long. You're embarrassing me. People are hearing you out in the hall." You know, no. But the labor pain is what Jesus compared grief to. And in fact, he says to his disciples, and this is in the Passion translations, which I've come to like very much, "Let me be quite clear. You will weep and be overcome with grief over what happens to me. You will be filled with sorrow. So you will also pass through a time of intense sorrow when I am taken from you." There's no denying that grief is intense sorrow. And again, I'm not an expert on grief, but to me, grief involves 4 different journeys. There's all related, they all go on at the same time, but there's, at least from my experience, there's 4 different things that happen, 4 different journeys or processes that happen when you're grief. A physical journey, an emotional journey, a social journey, and a spiritual journey. We could spend our whole time on each one of these, but I just want to give you a couple things on each one of them. First of all, on the physical journey. One of the most helpful books I found was not written by a Christian, but written by a professor at Arizona University. Mary Flannery O'Connor, who has done research on grief. And she begins explaining the biological process of grief in your brain. So she explains that losing somebody close to you is like somebody stealing your dining room table in the middle of the night. And you get up and you go to get milk or a drink out of your refrigerator and you walk through your dining room and you expect to hit the dining room table because your brain tells you the dining room table is there. You may even think that you hit the dining room table until it's not there, and then it's gone. Because your brain maps everywhere that you go. That's how you know how to get back to other places, because your brain knows what's there. Your brain also tracks the people around you. As you're sitting here right now, the people close to you, you have a good idea where they are. Or if they're not where they are, a good idea where you can go to find out where they are. You're tracking where they are all the time subconsciously. The brain neurologically, biologically, initially cannot understand that the people you love are nowhere to be found, that they are nowhere in this world, and they will be looking for it. So that's why you may think that you see them. You may have dreams about them. You may think that you hear them, because your brain is processing the fact that they're not there. They're looking for them. I would have dreams that she was at the hospital and wanted to dance in the hospital, or that she was at the home we used to live in, or she was at home. This is the brain processing the fact that you cannot find them, and it's biological, it's neurological, and we all go through it. You can train your brain to understand that she's no longer here, just like you can train your brain not to eat as much and to lose weight. But it takes work, and it takes time, and we're all different in how we do that. So there's a biological process of your brain understanding grief, and it takes time, and it's different for everybody. But there's also a huge physical impact of grief. Here's one study that I found. Losing a spouse makes men 70% more likely to die within a year. Right? 70% more likely to die because of the impact that it has. Now, when I first heard this number, I thought, well, okay, that's because, most widowers are older, and so that would affect them more. But no, the study shows that the younger people were when they lost their spouse, the more susceptible they were to dying within a year. And overall, researchers found that in the year after losing a spouse, men were 70% more likely to die than similar aged men who did not lose a spouse, while women were 27% more likely to die compared to women who did not become widowed. So there is a huge physical impact to losing your spouse. So what do you do if you're the one grieving? You need to pay special attention. You need to give yourself self-care. Right? You need to get checked up. You need to exercise. You need to eat right, because you may not feel like doing this, but you are at high risk within the first year after losing a spouse. And if you have a buddy that's losing a spouse or losing somebody of significance in their life, you need to, as best you can, help them eat well, exercise, get checked up, because they are at physical risk. And you, as their buddy, need to encourage them in taking care of themselves. Just quickly then, there is also an emotional journey. A significant loss of spouse, child, close family member shakes you to your core. And when that happens, unresolved emotional issues in your life begin to surface. Maybe that you were not resolved and you hadn't thought about it. Grief is not a handyman's job. It's not a leaky faucet. It's not a running toilet. It's not a squeaky floor. It is a gut renovation. And when you do a gut renovation and walls come down that you're used to seeing and floors come up, you all of a sudden see things, maybe problems you didn't know that you had, or maybe problems that you thought you had but you didn't want to deal with. And you have to deal with those before you can proceed with your renovation. And our tendency is to run from these emotions when they appear, thinking that we're showing strength from running our emotions. But actually, the opposite is true. Lamentations tells us, arise, cry out in the night, in the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. God invites you to pour out your emotional pain to him. But not only to him, he's designed us to be dependent upon each other. We need to have somebody that we can express these emotions to face-to-face in person. I personally have found counseling to be enormously helpful in this process, and I recommend it to anybody. I wish I had done it earlier. There are parts of me that are better off now than they have ever been because of the counseling that I got after grief. Counseling, the need for counseling was the main conclusion I came to when I was sitting on the beach in Florida. But you also need to have a buddy that you can talk to, one that you can say as much as you can to him. I'm fortunate to have my buddy Steve here today, who's been with me every step of the way with this. And I actually don't know what I do without him, because everybody needs a buddy like that. You maybe can be a buddy, somebody now that you know is grieving, or somebody who will be grieving later. Know that they need a buddy to be able to talk to. There is also a social journey. Social journey meaning I walked into the hospital on the early morning of July 8th, 2021, a married man being married for 42 years. I walked out of the hospital a widower, single man. And not only did that change how I thought about myself, that also changed how everybody thought about me. From going to the dentist and having to check the widowed office, the widowed box, to my tax returns, to my car insurance, everything socially changes when you've lost a spouse. And just to give you an example, a few months after my wife passed, there was an NCS conference. It was a 2-day conference. First day was the guys. Second day was couples only. So now this fellowship that I've been involved in, fellowships I've been welcoming in, I'm no longer invited to the couples only. Is that a bad thing? No, it's a good thing. It should happen, but it's an adjustment that I need to make, and it's adjustment that you need to understand that your buddies are going through if they've gone through a loss like that. One reason that we avoid social contact with people after they grieve is because we don't know what to say. Let me give you a couple of suggestions, because these are two things that if you don't remember anything else from what I say, remember this. Two things not to say to somebody who's grieving, and then an example of what to do. Do not say to anybody who's grieving any sentence that starts with the word "at least." At least you have your grandkids. At least you had 42 years with her. At least she's no longer suffering. Yes, you're not telling me anything new. I know all those things. I know I was married 42 years. I know I have 32 grandkids. I know she's with Jesus. That's not telling me anything. And when you say "at least," you are impliedly telling me that I should not feel as bad as I do. So you are looking right past my pain, and you are not seeing me at a time when I most need you to see me. So avoid anything that starts with the phrase "at least." Another thing is, do not compare your grief. Oh, I know just how you're feeling. I lost my aunt last month. I've lost an aunt too. It's nothing like losing your spouse. When a few months after Ann passed, a young couple that had been in our Bible study, they lost the baby to sudden death in crib syndrome, 18-month-old baby. It was devastating. I went to see them. I went to the funeral, their service. I would not say to them, "I know just how you're feeling," because I don't know. I know they're feeling terrible, but it's not still the same because every grief is unique. So don't compare your grief with somebody else's. And it's difficult to say, but it's surprising that it has to be said, but grief is not a competition. You're not trying to one-up somebody and say like, oh, well, Frank, his wife had dementia for 20 years and she didn't even know him for 10 years. So you didn't have to go through that. Like, you're right, you win. Frank had it worse. That's not helpful to somebody that's experiencing grief. Let me close with a good example of what on being social is. There's a guy that was on my on the elder board with me, 20 years younger than me, I guess, or something like that. He was gently persistent with me about getting together for lunch. I must have turned him down like 6 times, but he was persistent. And you can expect that people are grieving. It may turn you down several times, but we know who's asking to meet with us and not. And so I met with him, and he said, and when we sat down in the restaurant, the first thing he said was, he says, look, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know if I should hug you, if I should not hug you. I don't know. All I know is like, I love you, and I respect you, and I love hanging out with you. And that's what we need to hear. Maybe that last part, more than anything else, that you love hanging out with us. Okay, very briefly on the spiritual journey. The pain, again, is not something to hide away from. The pain and the doubt are something that does not offend God, does not intimidate God. Jeremiah says here, we know the book of Job. Job throws all kinds of allegations against God, and God says that Job spoke rightly. Not that he was correct in what he said, but God invited him to pour out all of his complaints to him. This verse I ran across recently in Jeremiah. Why is my pain unceasing, my wound incurable, refusing to be healed? Will you be to me like a deceitful brook, like waters that fail? He's basically accusing God of being fake. I'm hurting, I'm coming to you, and you're as phony as what looks to be a brook to give me water, and it is not. So God is not intimidated by those things. He does invite them to us. So let me tell you where I am on this, right? Paul Tripp says that grief exposes the difference between your confessional belief and your actual belief. What I believe about God, and what I actually truly believe about God. So, do I believe God is good all the time? Maybe not as much as I used to. Do I believe God loves me? Probably not as much as I used to. And I can say that to him. I can tell him that because he invites us to communicate that to him. In fact, I think in a way that's what he most wants to hear from us. So I can say that, do I think that this is good? No, I can't see it. I can't see good coming out of it. Or even if I could see good, it's not a good that I would want. But what I can see that is, if this is good, then it's profound. If this is good, then it's beyond what I can imagine as good. And if God is one who can make this good, then he is beyond what I imagine. And I can rest in the fact that although I can't see it, my heart is here. This is where I am. For God alone, my soul in silence waits. Truly, my hope is in him. I pour out my complaint. I pour out my anguish. I don't know the answer. It is not well with my soul. I do not have peace like a river in my soul. I pour it out to God and I wait because I know that my hope is only in him. So, thank you guys. And I just want to say that if any of you are experiencing grief, I would love to hang out with you. I would love to hear your story. I would benefit from hearing your story and hanging out with you. All right, thanks.